South Africa and China recommitted their 26-year working relationship during President Cyril Ramaphosa's state visit yesterday. The two presidents signed 8 bilateral agreements. These include increasing trade in agricultural products from South Africa to China. The 9th Forum on China-Africa Cooperation will also be taking place later this week in Beijing. The platform, of course, was established in the year 2000, and this is to promote cooperation between China and African countries. So what can we make from this week's Africa and China relations? Let's get some analysis, and for that we're joined by Dr. Lauren Johnston, who is, of course, with the University of Sydney and their China Studies Centre. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us, and we really do appreciate your time all the way from down under and all the way across the globe. This is such an important discussion, and of course the global community are going to be watching what comes out of these talks between certainly Africa and China, but also I think South Africa and China. Perhaps things that you think are really important for the two countries to get right. They have, of course, released their statement of intent between the two countries, and one of the things that they've brought that seems to be quite emphatic is that they're both in support of Palestine, for instance, in the Gaza conflict. And I actually want to just quickly read it up because I think it's interesting. Just a moment. It says that China commended the positive role that South Africa played in activating the role of the international community in the conflict, and South Africa expressed its appreciation to China for successfully inviting various Palestinian factions to sign the Beijing Declaration. This is quite the line being drawn in global geopolitics, yes?
Yes, definitely. It does point toward a sort of a global South challenging of some status quo assumptions of, the global community and the unity of BRICS members, for example.
Yeah. What do you think then this says about the strengthening of BRICS? I mean, this is happening at a time when Turkey is also asked to formally join BRICS. Even as the Chinese president meets with other African heads of state, is this a strengthened China as opposed to what the West is looking at and how it views him?
Well, I think this week's activities are slightly separate to BRICS, though obviously there are some BRICS overlay in terms of South Africa, Ethiopia, and other potential interested members. And to the extent that China forges a greater agreement and alliance with African countries this week, that would probably feed into this bigger BRICS agenda, which, sure, indeed, does challenge a lot of assumptions about the status quo of global governance, the status quo of, how trade flows, which technology standards are used. One of the agreements that you just noted was signed between Xi and Ramaphosa was a Baidu navigation, a satellite navigation agreement. That points to all sorts of technological competition and standards and challenges. So indeed, that the BRICS agenda and the challenge to the status quo is definitely increasing as a result of this forum on China-Africa, but I wouldn't call it a BRICS. Yeah. It's not a BRICS summit. This week is not.
No, and we understand that it's not, but on the sidelines, of course, developments taking place around BRICS, and that's why I brought it up. But let's bring it back into China and Africa. You've written a piece, in fact, where in the conversation that it's been published in the Conversation here in South Africa, and you talk about a Chinese mining presence in Africa, how it compares to Western presence in Africa, and perhaps break that down for us and really what it looks like in the SADC region particularly. You talk a lot about what Chinese mining presence looks like in Zim, and if it's been good for these countries.
Well, yeah, I guess over the last 2 decades, China's resources relationship with Africa has been quite oil-focused, a bit, in terms of Angola, Sudan, a bit further north. Now this renewables race and this sort of intensifying, well, first of all, the intensifying need to, prevent accelerating climate change, and then this intensifying geopolitical contest for, influence and manufacturing in that new energy game has massively intensified the importance of the minerals in countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, but especially Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Congo, because they have such a density of important minerals from cobalt to copper to lithium. And you mentioned Zimbabwe, and it is an incredibly interesting relationship. They have a very deep political relationship and history over recent decades with China. And China has opened just months ago even the largest steel mill in all of Africa in Zimbabwe, which uses local iron ore products at the moment. It might import later from other countries. And they're also building I think it's a lithium processing plant. And so this kind of, it's I would say Zimbabwe and hence SADC is the frontier of China's attempt to begin to manufacture and value add industrial kind of products and to turn minerals into more value added rather than just shipping them all the way to China. So it's definitely new, like the steel mill is new, the lithium production process, but it's a bit of a frontier, and to some extent it challenges South Africa's steel industry also. And South Africa has slapped some solar panel import tariffs on China's imports. So there's a bit of a game between SADC countries, as well as an amazing importance to shift some of that production to create jobs, to improve trade balances, to pay off debt. So what does happen in Zimbabwe actually might be quite important for the whole SADC region in that context.
Yeah, you write about key concerns as well for development. This is for African countries as they continue to strengthen relations, for instance, with China. And I found this quite interesting. You say, according to the International Energy Agency, China controls over 80% of the global manufacturing steps involved in making solar panels. Is that to say that there isn't much to benefit then for African countries?
Well, I guess that depends how and when some of that technology and processing capacity is transferred. And the key challenge actually is that at the moment, China can make those solar panels incredibly cheaply in China, which some countries argue is uncompetitive. But nonetheless, they can produce them very cheaply. And that enables countries like Niger or Burkina Faso, who are much poorer than South Africa, to access energy supplies that they don't have, sustainable energy supplies in a most affordable way. But for a country like South Africa or perhaps even Morocco or Egypt, it represents a challenge to their own current industrial kind of aspirations. So there's a bit of push and pull. On the one hand, some countries just want the affordable access to, instigating energy supply, and other countries want the supply to be moved to their country. So this is like a real kind of hard negotiation to get the right balance across African countries given different needs.
Yeah, I want to go back to conflict resolution, and I mentioned at the top of the interview just the hard line that both countries have taken where Palestine and Israel is concerned, expressing their support rather to Palestine. And then there's a question around if you're seeing the same sort of energy where the Russia-Ukraine war is concerned, right? So you did see the two countries, commending each other on their roles played in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But if you feel that that's strong enough and what that does to their geopolitical positioning.
I think from what I can see, there's perhaps less of a direct kind of approach to the Ukraine-Russia story than to the Gaza story. In South Africa, I guess there's obviously the political history with the PLO and all the rest in Palestine. So that's, yes, there may be some movement, but I don't think it's as intensive as the Gaza story. But that's also partly because obviously Egypt has a border with Gaza and Israel, and that brings it kind of closer to home in a more direct sense also.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that obviously is going to be asked is whether or not the global community thinks that the strengthening of relationships between China and South Africa bodes well for South Africa's global relationships, for instance. I mean, there's the ongoing discussion around how South Africa trades with the US, and if this presents a threat to South Africa's relations with the West, in your view.
I don't know if it presents a threat to its ties. I mean, I guess it depends who's trading what and who wants what from different countries. Talking from Sydney, I actually think it probably presents a bigger threat to Australia because China wants to buy very similar products from South Africa than it might otherwise buy from Australia, in terms of, wine and so on. But I think there's a very unique, if I'm not wrong, Xi Jinping might have visited South Africa more than any other country in Africa during his time as president, partly because of FOCAC being held there, partly because of BRICS and so on. So there's sort of multilateral and bilateral reasons. And given the relative maturity of the South African economy, it's probably important for China to get this relationship correct because it sort of points to where it might go with other countries. So, if South African industry can't compete with China, maybe that implies it will be hard to get industry started anywhere else.
Yeah.
So, and on top of that, China now has this agricultural trade push, and it's doing that for a number of reasons. First, it wants to diversify its own food import supplies from Australia, from the US, from wherever. And it also understands that the highest density of poverty in most countries is in rural areas.
Yeah.
So if you can stimulate agricultural production, you can help to alleviate poverty.
Right.
And so it's like a growth model. And South Africa is quite important there because it also has the highest phytosanitary standards. So
Right.
South Africa tends to be the first country to be able to export lemons or oranges or avocados. And obviously, once you get South Africa going, maybe that serves as a role model for kind
the rest
of Kenya
of the African
or
continent. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Okay.
in a way, it's kind of important for South Africa to push all those phytosanitary standards, make sure it can get its agricultural goods in, and then that will kind of foster back to all many other African countries.
Yeah.
So it's probably super important that that aspect succeeds.
Yeah, and we'll be waiting, of course, to see when things do kick off for the China-Africa Summit. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Dr. Johnston. This is very enlightening. Dr. Lauren Johnston speaking to us from Melbourne in Australia this morning. She's with the University of Sydney's China Studies Centre.